Welcome to the Strokecast. A Generation X stroke survivor explores rehab, recovery, the frontiers of neuroscience, and how to peel a banana with one hand.
Hello, and welcome to episode 25 of the Strokecast. After my stroke, I began looking for support and knowledge both online and in the real world, as many of us do. You know, sort of getting out of the house and getting out of the apartment is so important if we're able to go interact with other folks and talk with other survivors and other folks who, you know, can relate to what we're going through. Among a bunch of the awesome groups I met, I joined the Young Adult Stroke Survivors group here in Seattle. It's a large group filled with fascinating survivors, caregivers, and volunteers. Each monthly meeting generally has anywhere from 20 to 50 people attending. So it's definitely a substantial one, and it takes a lot to pull it together and keep it running. I talked a lot more about this group back in episode 7, where I talked with Garrett. Now, one of the people who makes these meetings happen is Reva Zimmerman. Reva, along with Natalie, coordinate the support from the University of Washington student volunteers that help with setup, moving chairs and tables, assisting members and attendees, working with the caregivers breakout, taking notes, building transcripts, and, you know, really just so much more in each meeting. And this week, I'm delighted to sit down with Reva to talk more about her work in studying aphasia. Our conversation covers things like the nature of language, exactly what aphasia is, and how folks with aphasia in the Pacific Northwest can partner with the University of Washington for social support and research opportunities. We met on a beautiful summer day at the Wayward Coffee House in the Green Lake area of Seattle. It's sort of a local center for all sorts of geek-oriented activities and, of course, coffee. The walls feature plenty of sci-fi content, including those famous last words, "I'm a leaf on the wind. Watch how I soar." And if you know what that means, I'm sorry, I just made you tear up. It's just a really neat place here in Seattle. Reva Zimmerman is a PhD student and research associate on the clinical TALSA study in the Aphasia Research Lab at the University of Washington. She currently serves as a research associate on a multi-site study to create a clinical test of verbal short-term memory in aphasia. She also recently completed work on a study exploring conflict resolution and short-term memory in aphasic comprehension. And of course, as I mentioned, Reva also coordinates the UW student volunteers for the Young Adult Stroke Survivor group. In her free time, she enjoys chasing her preschooler, whom I've met, and there is definitely a lot of chasing involved, dancing, and engaging in activities to uplift students of color at the University of Washington. So, let's talk with Reva. So, Reva, thanks for joining us on Strokecast this week.
You're so welcome.
I'm really glad we could go ahead and have this conversation.
Yeah, me too.
So, with your background, with a focus on working with aphasia and students studying to be speech therapists and working with aphasia, how did you get into this field? What is it that really appeals to you?
I think in general, I've had a kind of a rough road to hoe over the course of my life, and have gone through a lot of really tough experiences, and have worked to overcome those and still continually work to overcome them. And as I was training to become a speech therapist, when I started working with people with aphasia and stroke survivors, there was something about the stories of these folks that really resonated with me. This idea that, you know, something devastating has happened in your life, and yet you're not going to let that define you. You're going to keep pushing on and persevering and doing what you need to do. It really, really spoke to me, and I think for that reason I got into aphasia specifically. The reason that I got into speech therapy is because really honestly. I was studying linguistics, and as I was getting ready to graduate for undergrad, I realized that I wasn't going to be able to find a job. So I actually double majored in linguistics and communication disorders.
Okay.
And then from there moved on to speech therapy. But when I started my master's program, I really didn't have a sense of what population I wanted to work with. I thought I was going to work with English language learning kids when I first started my master's program. So I'm glad that hasn't happened, because I really tremendously enjoy working with stroke survivors.
That's awesome. Linguistics itself is a fascinating field, too.
Yes.
A friend of mine who was doing TESOL back in college, teaching English to speakers of other languages, started introducing me to some of these concepts of just the different linguistic structures and the core phonemes, I think was the term she used, for the different sounds and how that manifests into words. And that's really fascinating. Do a lot of folks in speech therapy and working with aphasia also have a linguistics background, or has that given you sort of a unique take on the field?
I would say probably about a third of people that I've met have a background in linguistics. I've met a lot of people with backgrounds in English. So they got a BA in English, and I've met a lot of people who have a background in psychology. And I think that in a lot of cases, a lot of us come to the field for the same reason. We love language, we love the way that the brain processes information and develops, but we're looking for a way to apply that and help people or make a career out of it. So, yeah, I think it's pretty evenly split among these other backgrounds.
That's really interesting how that happens. You know, it's interesting, too, how a lot of, unlike when I talk to folks in PT or OT, a lot more of them come to the field from a sciences, a math, or a medical, biological background, whereas with speech, we're seeing more folks come from, for lack of a better term, the soft sciences, the liberal arts fields, which, as a liberal arts major, I think that is fantastic.
Right.
What I also think is really interesting, and one of the things I didn't even really ever think about until I, obviously started doing my deep dive into neurology and stuff, is the idea that most of us think that our thoughts are in words, and the idea that what you're thinking and your ideas really are divorced from the language center and from the idea of tying words to them. That becomes a very interesting idea in how the brain processes information.
Right. Yeah, I'm kind of generally, within linguistics, interested in this idea of the relationship between language and other processing modalities. So how we pay attention to things, how we remember things, how we process visual information or spatial information. And there's a huge amount of debate going on in research right now about whether language mediates these other functions, whether we need language to be able to label and define some of the things that we see, or to be able to organize a plan as we're, say, getting ready for work in the morning. Some researchers say, no, language isn't necessary. Other researchers say language plays a really big part, especially, say, in something like visual processing, because you have to be able to describe what direction to go on a map or something like that. But I don't know. I kind of am two minds, because I meet people with aphasia who are they might have zero expressive language. They can't utter 2 words. But if you give them some other type of problem, math problem, a visual puzzle, something like that, they can do it with no issues. So there's obviously still very capable individuals, even though they've lost their capacity for being able to speak or sometimes understand basic language around them.
Right.
That's really interesting. That's a real fascinating space. I've recently encountered the idea that, folks, if you don't have a word thing, at the most basic level, some of what we're talking about here is the idea of if you don't have a word for a color, can you see that color? Mm-hmm. And can you actually make that connection in your brain? And I think that becomes real interesting in there.
Yeah.
One of the other things you talk about there and that they've touched on there is all the different elements with memory and cognition and all this other stuff. I've long felt that speech therapy has probably the worst branding in the rehab and recovery space, even worse than occupational therapy, who, you go to the OTs, they're not going to get you a job. That's not what it is. But speech therapy is about so much more than just speech, it seems.
Yes. Yeah. Speech therapists, just thinking about working with adults, not thinking about working with kids. Working with adults, I help people with their thinking skills. So back to attention, memory, executive function, which involves planning or problem solving. So I help with thinking skills or cognitive skills. I help with language. I help with speech, which is distinct from language. So there are a lot of folks who, after their strokes, have what's called dysarthria, which means that the muscles are weak or they're not very fast anymore, and so they have a hard time speaking. Their speech sounds distorted.
It's sort of why one of the symptoms of a stroke is the slurring of speech.
Absolutely.
When you lose control of the muscles in the tongue and the lips and that stuff.
Absolutely, yes. And that's distinct from language. Language is the symbols that we use to represent objects or concepts. And I would help people with swallowing. And I help people with voice and sometimes, in some cases, just being able to breathe without a vent. So just working with adults in an acute care type of setting, those are the main things that I do on a daily basis as a clinician. And that's a lot, and it's hard and speech language pathologist doesn't capture that at all.
Right.
So if I go into work with someone on their thinking skills, if I say I'm a speech therapist, they say, I don't have a problem with my speech. Why are you here?
Right.
So I started walking in and saying, I am, I'm the therapist that's going to help you with your thinking skills or something like that. I kind of twist it around because speech language kind of pigeonholes us into a couple of things that don't fully describe what we do.
And there's a certain level of irony there. The challenge with the field is that it doesn't quite have the language to describe what the field does.
Well, I mean, yeah, but, speech, language, cognition, swallowing, voice therapist is just too much.
Right. Exactly. So, how do you... So one thing, we hear a lot more of these terms come up, and aphasia is a term we just start hearing, and then we may start hearing about apraxia and dysarthria. Yeah. What is the distinction among these different terms?
Yeah, that's a great question. So aphasia is related specifically to the ability to understand and produce language. And that is reading language, writing language, understanding spoken language, or speaking itself. It happens in every language, including signed languages. So people who speak American Sign Language as their native language can also have aphasia.
And I just want to make that important distinction there, because that's something I only recently learned within the last few weeks, or something I'd never really thought about. But American Sign Language is not just a symbolic representation of English, like writing English is. It is an actual separate language, like Spanish or Japanese or whatever else, with its own dialects and accents.
Absolutely, yeah. And because it's a language, people can have just as much problem with a signed language as they do with a spoken language. So that's aphasia. Anything having to do with putting together words to make sentences for expression or comprehension. Apraxia is kind of like a disconnect between the program that your brain creates and your speech muscles. So your brain might have this plan, okay, you're going to put your tongue in this position and you're going to breathe out with this amount of force and things like that, but that message doesn't get to the speech muscles. And so you might put your tongue in the wrong position, or you might use too much force when you exhale. And that creates distorted language. And apraxia really most often occurs with aphasia. And there are certain aspects of apraxia of speech that sometimes make it difficult to tell apart from aphasia. Just because of the way sounds might get misordered or things like that. It's hard to tell if this person has apraxia of speech, the motor program is not going to their muscles, or are they having a hard time putting together the sounds in the right order. If it's putting the sounds together in the right order, that's aphasia. But if it's just the motor program, that's apraxia.
It's kind of like when you get gibberish coming out of your printer at home. Is the problem that the printer is not working, or is the problem that the Word document you're trying to print doesn't make sense to the printer?
Exactly. Yeah, that's a really great analogy. And then finally, there's dysarthria, which really means that there's a problem with the muscles. So in stroke, I'm sure you and a lot of your listeners are really familiar with this idea. If you have a stroke, your nerves are damaged such that you can't use the muscles properly. They don't respond to the message being sent from the brain. And just like you can have paresis in your arm or your leg, you can also have paresis or weakness in your tongue, in some of the jaw muscles, or your vocal cords. And that's going to result in dysarthria. So if apraxia is a problem with the message getting to the muscles, dysarthria is the muscles get the message, but they're not working properly.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So yeah, it's and teasing all that apart is got to be really complex and just a really fascinating aspect of the work that you do. So you were also when I saw you speak at the Swedish cerebrovascular support group, you talked a lot about some of the work that your lab is doing with the Washington Registry and some of those other really interesting things to sort of advance aphasia research and help survivors of aphasia get access to other potential therapies in the experimental stage that might or might not work, but we got to find out.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about that work?
Yeah. So just to clarify, I'm at the University of Washington Aphasia Research Lab. And our main goal is to develop more effective therapies for people with aphasia. So what that means is we have had researchers who look at reading disability in aphasia. So what does it look like? Are there certain characteristics that are common to all people with aphasia who also have reading problems? Is there some type of stimulus or facilitator that's more effective? We've looked at word finding treatments. So there are two main treatments that we've looked at in our lab. The first is semantic feature analysis, which most people with aphasia have probably had some experience with, whether they know it or not. Usually it involves seeing a picture of something. So the therapist shows you a picture and then says, what's this item? What does this, if it's a picture of a dog, for example, what's this a picture of? Okay, what does this item sound like? What does this item feel like? Do you like these things or whatever? So trying to find different ways for people to get at the word for dog.
Interesting. That I think and that's probably one of the things they were testing for when I was in the ER in the first few days, where they showed me the picture of this woman in this A-line skirt and kids in the kitchen, and she's trying to do dishes.
Oh, yes.
And they asked asked me to describe this picture.
Yep.
I told them, I gave them a one-word answer of 1956, which took them a moment, and then they're like, yeah, okay, that's fine.
That's funny. Yes, I'm very familiar with that picture. It's a picture description task. So, ideally, you would be able to say a few things, like the woman is staring off into space while the sink is overflowing, and whatever.
And we'll add that picture to the show notes for anybody who hasn't seen it.
Right, yeah. I'm sure most of your listeners have probably seen it at some point. So the therapies that we worked on, semantic feature analysis, just working on getting people to find the words that they're looking for through different types of questioning. Tell me about the things you know about this picture. Another treatment that we've worked on and that was really developed by the lab director, Diane Kendall, is called phonomotor therapy. And that therapy is a little bit more experimental. It's shown promising results, and we're still in the process of analyzing the data that we have for this study. But essentially the idea is that we are helping people rebuild their speech sound repertoire so that they can have access to all of the words. So let's see.
Is that sort of like how they taught us to read in the 1970s with the phonics approach and sounding things out and starting with these are the sounds that come from these particular things, then you can build the words from that?
Kind of, but even more basic than that.
Okay.
So it's based on a model of language where learning language starts at the level of the speech sound or phoneme. So when you're a baby, you start playing with sounds like ba, 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 or ga, 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 and then as you become more sophisticated, you start to blend those sounds together. So ba, ga, until finally, as a kiddo, you can say bagel.
Gotcha.
And then
starting with the priorities.
Right. Who doesn't love bagels?
Absolutely.
So this idea that you have to master the sound first before you can sequence it with other sounds. And then once you can put those sounds in a sequence, you get a word. And then you start to put the words together to make a sentence. And then from there you go to discourse. So that's basically the idea behind the treatment.
Okay.
And maybe another way to put it is that the one thing that all words have in common is that they all have sounds in them, speech sounds in them. So if we can start with the level of the sound and make the representations of sounds in our brains really strong again, then it should be easier for us to get up to words. There's a lot of theoretical modeling that goes into that.
Sure.
That's kind of hard to explain even to other researchers if they're not familiar.
Right. And then combine that with the fact that every stroke is unique in its own detailed implementation.
Absolutely.
So it's not necessarily strictly reproducible.
Right. Well, and the thing that's always hard with research, especially in the area of language, is they're based off of theories, which by their very definition, they have to be able to be disproved. If you can't prove your theory wrong, then it's not a theory. So the implication of that is that this might not be the right theory. We don't have any way of knowing whether the theory that phonomotor is based on is actually how language works in our brain. And all we have to go off of is what predictions this theory makes about how people would do. And our preliminary findings on the research studies that have been done so far suggest that there's strong evidence to think that language might work the way that the theory supposes. But 10 years from now or 5 years from now, another theory that might come out that's even better at capturing what happens behaviorally. when we're working with people with aphasia or just in the context of normal language. So let's see, going back to research studies. So we just finished up a big clinical trial that pitted semantic feature analysis against phonomotor treatment. Everyone that participated, or I would say most people that participated, demonstrated significant gains. That means that their language got significantly better at the end of treatment. And for the people that did phonomotor therapy, they also had continued treatment or even greater improvements 3 months after treatment ended.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, so we asked people to come back and they were still making gains, which is one of those indicators that this theory might be good.
The momentum helps carry it through even when they're not seeing the researchers on a
Right. Yeah. So the theory that it's based on is it might be a better predictor of how language works in the brain. So yes, but we're still analyzing the data. We're trying to understand why some people get better and why some people don't. That's the really frustrating thing, because everyone in our lab is a speech therapist by training.
Right.
So we want our people to get better.
Right.
And so it's really fantastic when you see people come out saying words that they weren't able to say before, or being able to get through conversations more easily in their everyday lives. That's awesome. That makes us really happy. But we get really, really frustrated when there are folks who don't improve at all. And so we're still going through those data to try and figure out if there's something about the treatments or something about the folks themselves that might influence why they didn't improve.
Right.
So that research is ongoing.
Everything from potential biological causes to potential cultural causes to potential personal familial situations, all of that coming into play.
The nature of their aphasia, are they generally more severe? Do they generally have more problems with sound processing, or do they have more trouble with meaning? Things like that to try and figure out what might be going on with these folks. So the next time we develop a big treatment study, we can try and make it better so we can get those people.
Right, absolutely. So in terms of getting those people, can you talk a little bit about the registry?
Oh, yes, our registry and repository. So the registry is essentially a big list of people in the Pacific Northwest mainly who have aphasia. So people, when they find out about the registry, either online or through their speech therapist, they just give us a call and we collect some basic information about them, their name, contact information, some background information about when they had their stroke, what their occupation was, whether they're native English speakers. And the people that are in our registry, they get information about different events going on in the community that might be relevant to them. So sometimes the Aphasia Lab puts on small events as a way to try and really make our lab feel like a community. So going out for walks at Seward Park or going for hikes, things like that.
And bringing folks together with aphasia, with other folks with aphasia.
Yes.
Suddenly you're talking with other folks or attempting to speak with other folks who get it, who are going through the same thing that you are.
Absolutely, yeah. And I just met someone who is a younger guy, like in his 40s, who has aphasia but not from a stroke. And so he doesn't feel comfortable at the stroke survivor groups because he didn't have a stroke, but he still is trying to connect with other people with aphasia.
Sure.
And so he contacted us, and we were able to provide some resources, contact this person, come into the clinic and we can see if you might be interested in a language group. So it's a really great way to put other people with aphasia in contact with each other. We recently put on an event for a moms group. So there are a number of women between their 30s and 50s who still have kids that they're raising, trying to run a household, doing all of those things, but they have aphasia.
Sure.
And so they, being a parent and being kind of in the most productive part of your life is challenging enough.
Right.
But as you know, add a stroke on top of it, it's really hard. Add aphasia on top of it. I think for some people, sometimes it feels really, really almost insurmountable.
Sure.
And so we were able to get together a group of younger women who are in that position, were or are working, have kids, just so that they could support each other.
Right.
Because they're the only ones that know what it's like to have aphasia, but still have to try and get your kids ready for school in the morning.
Absolutely.
Right?
And even before getting them ready for school, they're a little younger, trying to help them acquire language skills
Right.
and learn to speak when
Right.
you're not able to necessarily model it in the same way.
Right, absolutely.
For them,
Absolutely.
so.
Yeah, so yeah, that's one of the main functions of the registry, is just to be able to have a place where we can keep information about stroke survivors so we can put them in contact with each other and try to help build a community. And then another purpose of the registry is to have a pool of people that we can contact for research opportunities. So when people sign up for the registry, they can let us know if they're interested in research or not. If they're not interested in research, that's fine. They can stay on the registry and still be contacted about events and opportunities. But if they are interested in research, we ask them to come in to do what's called repository testing. And that's where we do some basic background tests of thinking skills, of neglect. So neglect is something that typically happens with right hemisphere strokes, where you can only see about half of the right visual.
That's okay. We're audio,
field.
so the hand
Yeah.
gestures aren't really
I
going to
know.
make that much difference.
So, but just because of the way that the optical system works, sometimes if you have a right stroke, you might have what's called a left neglect, which means that everything in your left visual field, you don't see it.
Right.
Unless you actively tell yourself, look to the left.
Even though the eyes work perfectly,
Yeah.
and they're sending all that data to the brain,
Yeah.
the brain is just not seeing sort of part of the left field from each of the eyes. It's not like it's ignoring the left eye, but paying attention to the right one.
Right. It's just not, the information is not getting to higher processing centers in the brain.
Right.
So we test for neglect, we test for thinking skills, and then of course we test for language. So we do kind of the standard language battery: naming, understanding sentences, reading sentences, speaking at the sentence level, picture description, kind of similar to what you're talking about,
Sure.
but it's a different picture.
So you can't cheat on the test.
No, you can't cheat on the test. So, and then and that takes about 2 hours. And then once people have done repository testing, we put those data in a database where no names are attached to it. So that information might be used later for some kind of analysis. For example, I used it for a statistics project that I had, but no names are attached to it. And then also, once we have information about people's linguistic profile, anybody doing any research studies in our lab can look at the profile and say, Bill looks like a really great candidate for my study. His section in the registry says that he would like to participate in research. Let me give him a call. And then you kind of go from there, and the researcher will screen you to see if you're a good fit for the study.
Sure.
So that's the function of the Northwest Registry and Repository.
So it's a great help for those who, with aphasia, who may want to have more community, may want to participate in research to help advance the field, and really it's a great reason for folks who are interested in speech therapy to study at the University of Washington to get access to this pool to advance their own research.
Yeah. We have a lot of folks who participate who are always keen or excited to find out what we learn from their data. So sometimes it's more or less accessible.
Sure.
Because sometimes it's very jargony.
Sure.
But we're always happy to share whatever findings we have with people.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So for folks who aren't lucky enough to live in the Pacific Northwest, are there comparable registries in other regions of the country or other places that folks could look to participate in these types of things? And for the Pacific Northwest Registry, we're going to have all those links in the show notes.
Yeah. I know that there are a lot of registries in Florida, definitely because that's where the director of our lab is from. So She learned in Florida how to create a registry, and then she brought it up here. And then she's had several PhD students graduate and then go back to Florida. So I know that there are registries being established in University of Florida, University of Central Florida, University of Delaware, Pittsburgh University, Temple University, and I believe there's also another university in Arizona, but I cannot remember off the top of my head.
Okay. So if you are out in one of these communities or in a different community, and it's something you think you might be interested in participating for, go ahead and contact the local universities.
Yeah.
Most of them that have a speech therapy department. Go ahead and ask if they have such a registry, and if not, hey, refer them over to the UW to learn how they can go ahead and create their own.
Right. And there are a lot of universities that don't have registries, but they still do active research with people with aphasia. So if you're looking, what's great about research is sometimes you can find a treatment study that will pay you to come in and have speech therapy. So, for example, the big clinical trial that we just wrapped up, participants got paid $300 to do speech therapy, whereas usually if you're having therapy, you have to pay a lot more than $300. So participating in research sometimes can be a really, really great way to get free therapy or even get paid for therapy. Or sometimes participate in research that's not therapy per se, but it still might be linguistically rigorous enough that it feels a little bit like brain exercise.
Sure.
Yeah, so I will highly recommend that people just reach out to their local university to see what kind of research is going on.
Absolutely. Reach out or ask your caregiver to reach out, or ask at the whatever local support groups or Facebook groups you participate in.
Yeah.
And that is definitely a great thing to take advantage of. So, as you see people encountering this stroke world for the first time, what do you wish more survivors and caregivers knew early on in the process?
I wish that they knew that it does get better and it does get easier. I think when I have met people in the acute phase, the stroke has just happened, we're still in the hospital, staff are still trying to assess the patient and figure out what exactly is going on. It's really easy to believe that the world is ending. I think it's very, very tough, and it requires a lot of work, but it does get better, and it does get easier if you can find the right support. So, yeah.
And that brings us to the hack of the week.
I think, honestly, trying to use language as much as possible, no matter where you're at, trying to practice if reading or speaking or somehow engage. For some people, maybe you don't have any words, even just trying to gesture more. I think that's so important, and it's so good for helping your brain try to rewire itself. We were talking about neuroplasticity earlier, like trying to rewire itself to access those language symbols in their brain. Keep using language.
Well, Reva, thank you so much for joining us.
Bill. I really appreciate it.
This has been fantastic.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Yeah, and I can definitely be reached at University of Washington Aphasia Lab, either through aphasia@uw.edu or my personal email, robinrm@uw.edu.
Awesome, and we'll have all of that in the show notes as well. So you can just head on over to strokecast.com/Reva to get all of those links.
As you can tell, I really enjoyed chatting with Reva and geeking out over the nature of language. So what did you think? Let us know in the comments over at strokecast.com/Reva. If you live with aphasia in the Pacific Northwest or care for someone who does, check out the Northwest Aphasia Registry and Repository. You can find that link again over at strokecast.com/Reva. If you don't live in this region, contact your local universities or support groups to look into other research opportunities or local registries sharing the same purpose. Share this episode with a friend, a colleague, or relative by telling them to go to strokecast.com/Reva. And of course, as always, don't get best, get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you next week.
The Strokecast, Bill Monroe, and Bill's guests provide general information and entertainment, not medical advice. Please do not make any changes to your treatment plan or the execution of your treatment plan without first consulting your personal doctor or medical team. The Strokecast is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.